All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for attending today. We're here for the 2023 Triennial Review of Rule 2, or the Arkansas Surface Water Quality Standards. I really appreciate everyone coming today. We appreciate your attendance and participating in the stakeholder process. We value your feedback and look forward to hear what you have to say to some of the proposals that we're making today. My name is Joe Martin. I'm the manager of the Water Quality Planning Branch here at the Office of Water Quality at the Arkansas DEQ. I just want to introduce a few folks from DEQ that are in attendance today. In the back of the room, we have Alan York. He is the Associate Director of the Office of Water Quality. Attending via Zoom, we have Stacy Wassel. She is the Deputy Associate Director of the Office of Water Quality. In the front row here, I have Mary Barnett. She is the Ecologist Coordinator in Office of Water Quality, runs the Water Quality Standards Program. I have Taylor Cochran here. She is a biologist for the Water Quality Planning Branch. Against the wall over there, we have Chance Garrett, ecologist, Lindsay Boyle, ecologist, and Dr. Yinki Shiyemi, ecologist for the Water Quality Planning Branch. So with that, I'll let Mary get started and we'll start giving our proposals. This might be a little different format than we've done in the past. What we're going to do is we'll give a presentation on one's proposals, and then we'll pause and we'll have time to discuss that. And then we'll go to the next presentation and such, and we'll go in that manner till we get through everything. So thank you so much for attending.
Well, I'm standing up here, but I can't advance my slides, so give us just a second. It's that same thing as every day. Oh, the mouse. Okay. Yay, okay. Always some little glitch with technology. We'll start off with a few housekeeping notes. Please, everyone, silence your cell phone to help us minimize distractions. And for those of us on Zoom today, will you please write your full first and last name and your affiliation in the Zoom chat so we can get you recorded on our attendance? And for those of you in the room, whenever you're making a comment or a question, we please ask you to state your name and then speak into a microphone. That way everybody can hear it. And for those on Zoom, they know who's talking since they're not here to see your name tag. We ask that we stick to one conversation topic at a time. And for those of you who are actively participating at the tables, those of you in our audience, if you have any comments or questions, please pass those to one of your seated representatives. The restrooms are on either side of the elevator, and we have coffee and there's water in the back. And if we have an emergency, our exit is over here. So the purpose of the work group is to assist DEQ with our triennial review. We appreciate all the unique perspectives that each of these different stakeholders in the room bring to the table. We're hoping that y'all facilitate discussion with us, and we're hoping to have an outcome of reasonable and achievable recommendations for our proposed 2023 triennial review. We would appreciate if our stakeholders could attend all of our meetings and remain respectful of all seated participants and their views. And we ask that we stay on topic. I know that there are many topics related to water that a lot of stakeholders wish to discuss. But if you have permit-specific comments or assessment methodology comments or questions, we ask that you hold those until those stakeholder processes are open. What is Rule 2? The Clean Water Act requires all states to establish water quality standards. Rule 2 is that for Arkansas. It establishes designated uses for waters of Arkansas and the criteria to protect those uses. The Clean Water Act requires standards to be reviewed every 3 years. So that's what we're here today for, our 2023 triennial review. So I keep trying to say 2023 because a lot of y'all are probably aware that the 2020 isn't completely final yet. So I wanted to give y'all an update on where it is. As you can see, we've been working on it since 2019, and we are so close. The commission adopted the 2020 triennial in January of this year, and we are scheduled to go to our two legislative committees, the Rules and Regs and the Public Health Committees, either this month or next month. And then after that, we'll submit it to EPA for final review. And after EPA's review is when it will be applicable for Clean Water Act purposes. So the 2023 triennial is why we're here today. And as you can see, we are in Stakeholder Workgroup, which is the very tip of the iceberg, our very first point. We're hoping to get a draft together to present to the governor's office for review by this fall, go to the commission this winter, move through the public notice, public hearing, and the public comment period, late winter or spring. Then we'll develop the response to comments. And that really depends on how long it takes. How long it takes depends on how many comments we receive. If we get a whole bunch, some really in-depth comments, we'll want to make sure we take our time to fully respond to those. So either spring or summer of 2023. Okay. So we're hoping to get it back before the commission for adoption in the summer of 23, legislative review, and EPA submittal in the fall. So it is quite a process, and we appreciate y'all here to help us get started. Now I'm going to pass it back off to Joe for our discussion.
All right, thank you, Mary. All right, so the first thing we're proposing for the 2023 is the removal of fecal coliform as an indicator in the water quality standards. Now, we are leaving E. coli, so it's not like we're stripping all the fecal indicator bacteria out of the rule, but fecal coliform we've known for a long time. It's not a very good indicator of GIS. If you recall the epidemiological studies that led up to 86 criteria that were done around 82, 83, those demonstrated that there just wasn't a good correlation between fecal coliform and the risk of gastrointestinal illness. That's why it was not in the 86 criteria. And again, of course, in 2012, they didn't go back to fecal. So we feel that's a good time to go ahead and take that out. Just have E. coli as the indicator in the rule. And really, if you're doing testing, if you run IDEX, they're the same test. So any kind of increase in cost or anything for anyone who is conducting this kind of sampling. So that's the first thing we're talking about. Those are the, we have up there what's currently in the rule as far as single sample geomeans for primary and secondary contact, but that will be all removed from the rule in 2023. All right, primary contact season. We've heard a lot about this, and so we decided to take a look at primary contact season and see if, what we felt on the books now is appropriate, or maybe we expand that. So one thing we looked at were some water temperatures. So we want to see, okay, what are the water temperatures on a variety of water bodies in Arkansas? And so we looked at Buffalo, Mulberry, Costot, Caddo, Kings, Lake Ouachita, and Bruce Ferry. And so if you look at the March temperatures, now these are 5-year averages in Fahrenheit. You typically, March is low to mid 50s, a couple excursions from that. You do get a little high 50s and one in the 60s, but typically board you're seeing low to mid 50s. You move to April and you start seeing temperatures get into more in the 60s there, with the exception of Greer's Ferry. Buffalo is a little cooler, but just under 60 degrees. And then, of course, May through September is what the primary contact season currently is. And then we went ahead and looked at October, and in October you still tend to see mid to high 60s as some water temperatures there. The other thing we wanted to look at is air temperatures. And so we use Little Rock just because it's centrally located. And so we looked at, once again, 5-year average air temperatures. And so in March, max average air temperature 66, below 44. In April, it goes up to 72. And then October, 75. So looking at that data, along with what are the other states doing, Region 6, surrounding states, and generally you see April or May through September or October. So currently what we have on the books is May 1 to September 30th. What we're proposing is to expand that from April 1 to October 31st. So that would be, we'd be adding 2 months to the primary contact recreation season for the 2023 review. The other thing, so currently in the rule it says for assessment of single samples, you need at least 8 data points. Well, minimum number of samples is not part of a water quality standard. And so for that reason, we feel like it's appropriate to take that out. Now we will put something in the assessment methodology related to that. At this point, we don't have any, we're not changing the number of single samples, that minimum of 8. We're just taking out the rule because it is not part of a water quality standard. The other thing is the calculation assessment of geometric mean. All right, that's currently what's in the rule is calculated on a minimum of 5 samples based in a 30-day period. Well, there are very few places in the state where we get 5 samples in 30 days. Very few. I can think of one water body, and other than that, I can't think of any. So because of that, the rule has set us up to where we can't assess any data because the data requirements are so tight, and very few people have the resources to go out and take 5 samples in 1 month. So what we want to do there is take that out and replace that with, for a geometric mean calculation, we will take all the samples taken in 1 primary contact recreation season. So depending on how this proposal goes, if we do end up adopting the proposal of April to October, we would take all the samples taken between April and October and calculate a geometric mean off that. If for whatever reason this new extended primary contact recreation season does not make it to adoption, then it would be May through September, what's currently on the books. So our proposal there is to expand the time frame with which you can take samples and calculate your geometric mean, which seems to be a more attainable way to assess bacteria criteria. All right, so those are the proposals we have now. Just to recap, extending the primary contact recreation season, adding a month on each end, taking the minimum number of samples out, not a water quality standard, and then changing the duration of which the geomean can be calculated from 30 days to a primary contact recreation season. So ultimately what that would look like in assessment terms is our period of record is 5 years. So we would have a geometric mean for each one of those 5 years. If that geometric mean busts, then that's a listing. All right. Any questions on that, on those proposals? Yes, sir, Mr. Simpson. Hold on, let me get you something.
Just curious about what if you only have 1 sample for the entire primary season?
That's a good question. I'm not of the opinion that 1 sample should be assessed against a geometric mean. This is interesting because, so in the 2012 REC criteria document, if you looked at the draft document put out in 2011, EPA did some analysis on this. And what they found was, for example, if you had 4 samples and the geometric mean was 30, all right, and your geo mean is 35. Now, remember, this is on, Enterococcus on coastal waters because that's all they used in that 2012 REC criteria document. They found that if you increase that sample size from 4 to 15, you reduce your frequency of misclassification by 50%. So essentially what they were saying in the draft document was the more samples, the better for geometric means, because the better the sample size, the more likely you are going to get that number correct. Now, when you went to the draft document, all that language was stripped out. And they said, well, if you got a single sample, you should compare that to the geometric mean. To me, there is much more inherent variability in a single sample than there is in a geometric mean. I mean, the reason why we use geometric means for calculating bacteria is because the extreme variability in bacteria data. Case in point, Dr. Alex Bohm out of Stanford did a paper back in 2007. It was titled, I believe, Extreme Diversity, or that's not the correct term. It was essentially Enterococcus concentrations in marine systems demonstrate extreme variability. All right, so sure, if we're talking about in the surf zone somewhere, we expect those numbers to be really high. But what she also looked at was in the back of the quiescent bay, was protected from any kind of wave movement. She took samples every 10 minutes, and then on a different study or on a different sampling event, she took samples every 1 minute. All right, so when samples were taken every 1 minute, the max change in Enterococcus was 140 CFU. Now remember that depending on which rec criteria document you're looking at, if it's the 86, it was 104. If it was a 2012, it's 130. So we're talking about in 1 minute, you can have the difference greater than what the criteria on the books is. Right? She also did sampling every 10 minutes, and the max change there was 345 CFU. So, I mean, there's so much variability in bacteria data taken, and this isn't even in a flowing system. This is, this is in a quiet bay, so I don't think this is as similar as we can get to lakes here. You're talking about that kind of variability. And when you have that kind of variability within samples taken every 1 minute, once again, that's a lot of variability built in when you're trying to compare that against the geometric mean. So in my opinion, I would not think it's appropriate to compare a single sample to the geometric. You can compare it to the single sample number, 298, but not to the 126. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Ms. Scott.
Okay, hi, I'm Erin Scott. So I do have a question about something that was not proposed, but caught my attention as I was looking at the EPA's guidance, their 2012 document called Recreational Water Quality Criteria.
Yes, ma'am.
And so they kind of go through, magnitude, duration, frequency for criteria, and they sort of align that to, okay, like, what is the level of public health protection that, that this is going to be effective for? And so just one question about the excursion frequency. Right now it's written as 25% of the samples collected cannot exceed that the IS value.
Correct.
And so in that EPA guidance, they recommend a 10% excursion frequency. And then, looking at some other states around that have sort of similar methods of evaluating bacteria in their surface waters, many of those states use a 10% excursion frequency. Some states use a 20%, we use a 25%. So I guess my question would be, has Arkansas sort of evaluated what that 25% excursion frequency, like what the level of public health protection that provides, and then have we considered reducing that excursion frequency to more closely align with EPA's guidance?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. So look at the 2012 document, once again, in the draft, they didn't have it. The 10% wasn't in there. It was a 25%. Water quality distribution was the same. Everything looked very similar to the 86 document. Now, when they come out with the final and they put that 10% in there, if you recall reading in there, basically they said, well, if you have a 10% excursion frequency, that'll force you to sample more. Because if you get one hit, you have to take 10 more samples to get a clean hit. All right. Now, there was no health endpoint to that 10% excursion frequency. That was just more, you would need to sample more. And leading up to the 2012, they went around the country hosting meetings. And in those meetings, nothing was mentioned about a 10%. So it doesn't seem to me, in what they had said leading up to that, in their draft document, in their final document, that there was any kind of health endpoint to the 10% excursion frequency. Further, if you looked at the epidemiological studies leading up to the 2012 rec and what they used to develop that criteria, they only had that one epidemiological study that was on freshwater. I say one, it was on 2 different lakes. There was Lake Erie and Lake Michigan. None of those epidemiological studies found any statistically significant correlation between fecal endocardial bacteria concentration and risk of GI illness. The rest of the studies were marine studies, and they went to Mississippi, but that one was halted due to a hurricane. They were in Fairhope, Alabama, Rhode Island, South Carolina, and Puerto Rico. Now, in all those, at one site, I can't recall if it's Alabama or Rhode Island, they found one statistically significant correlation between GI illness and qPCR. All right, now quantitative preliminary chain reaction is a way to analyze bacteria. It's a rapid method. It's used out on the West Coast, I know, so they can get same-day notifications back. But most folks do not use qPCR or the calibrator cell equivalents that number was associated with. In none of the marine studies they found any statistically significant correlations between GI illness and culturable bacteria. So being an inland state that uses culturable bacteria, the 86 criteria document actually did work on freshwater. I believe one of the studies was in Oklahoma and one of them was Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana. And so they found correlations there and thought that the 75th percentile was good. My thing with the 2012 REC criteria document was they didn't find anything in the epi studies. Not that they didn't, do a good job. You just don't know what you're going to find when you go out and collect ecological data. And so due to that, we didn't feel like that there was a good reason to adopt some of those numbers because we didn't feel like they were backed up by the data. If that had come out differently, and once again, I commend EPA on all the studies that they conducted because those epidemiological studies are not easy studies to put together or to run. But due to the fact that those studies didn't really find health endpoints in freshwater or with culturable bacteria, we didn't feel the need to adopt that 10%. Yes, sir.
John Allen, now I'm with Watershed Groups, and I just had a question about sampling protocol, and I realize that's not part of Reg 2, but since we're on that point, is there any recommendations by the DEQ to sample during differing conditions for bacteria, say runoff events or anything like that, to target different kinds of conditions at all?
For our ambient program, we do not target any time. We don't want to bias our events towards any particular flow regime. What we like to do is just ambient sampling, right? We say, okay, we're going to go out on this day every month. We go out there and collect that data, whatever the flow condition may be. We do not have targeted sampling towards low flow, high flow, storm flow, et cetera. Because once again, it's an ambient program, so we just want to catch it on, whatever day we say we're going to go out there and sample, and whatever the flows are, use that day. Anything else? Okay. That's all I have right now. I'll turn it over to Dr. Ishiyumi to present on pH site-specific criteria.
Again, my name is Oluwayinka Ishiyemi. For his pronunciation of my name, I just go by Yinka. So to save our job. For the following section, I'll be discussing site-specific pH criteria for a number of assessment units that we have listed in our. So, like I mentioned, I'll be discussing site-specific pH criteria for some of our assessment units that we have listed on the for today. These assessment units are located in the West Central and South west of Arkansas, and they include the Iron Fork Creek, the Dry Fork Creek, the Barren Creek, Short Creek, and Cannon Creek, and all are located in the Washita ecoregion. We are proposing a change of criteria from the conventional range of 6.0 to 9.0 range to a range of 5.5 to 8.5. And the reason behind this rationale is based on the fact that over the years, the water quality data that we've accrued from this assessment unit show a rather random distribution of data in the lower pH range as opposed to downward trend that we initially suspected might be the case for this assessment unit. Likewise, we assess the land use, land cover within the watershed where these units are located to ensure that there's no any anthropogenic factors that might be contributing to this lower range of pH that we've been seeing over the years in this assessment unit. In addition to that, we ensure to assess that there's no any MPDS facility, the upstream of this assessment unit to ensure that these facilities, as in there's no facility that might be contributing to a lower range of pH that we've been seeing over the years, like I mentioned in this assessment unit. Aside that, we suspect that the underlying geology of the parent rock material of the soil within this assessment unit might be the probable cause for the lower range of pH that we are observing in this assessment unit. And the reason being, for all of this assessment unit, the rock material is shale, and major component of shale is pyrite, iron sulfur, which is highly soluble. And so over the years, the dissolution of this could contribute to the lower range of pH that we've been observing in this assessment unit over time. And lastly, despite the lower range of pH, we see that this assessment unit still support aquatic livelihoods based on our biological assessments. So for Dry Creek here, like I mentioned, we do not see any significant trend in pH over the years, as indicated by our p-value here, and also the R-square, which is the coefficient of determination. Let me take a little bit. So with a pH, I said pH, with a p-value of less than 0.05, that's an indication of deviation from our hypothesis. That's a significant observation that could say that our non-hypothesis is default. So with this, like I mentioned, there is no any significant trend in pH over time. And even given our R-square here, the coefficient of determination, we could see here that only 6% of variation in pH can be explained over time. Likewise, when we assess the short-term continuous assessment of the GHAL pH value, we do not see any significant swing in the daily flux of pH beyond 1.0 significant, 1.0 standard unit. We see a gap here, and the result is because we have two deployments, one in June and one in August here. And even with that, we do not see any swing beyond 1.0 standard units. Likewise, for iron fork here, we do not see any significant trend in pH over time. Rather, we see a random distribution of values from 4.5 to 7.0 here. Similarly, for the short-term assessment of the diurnal pH, we do not see any significant swing in the daily flux of pH beyond 1.0. In fact, for this, we can see it's almost a smooth line here, despite the two period of deployment that we see. For Barren Creek, similarly, we do not see any significant trend in pH given the p-value, and the short-term assessment of the daily pH flux do not show any significant swing 1.0 standard units. For Short Creek, the same thing, no significant trend in pH value over time, and the short-term assessment of the same shows no significant swing in pH, daily pH flux. Just like the iron fork, the gap that we see here is a result of two deployments, one in June and the other one in August. And even with that, the numbers still oscillate between 6.5 and 7.5 here. So it's now beyond 1.0 standard unit of the swing. And lastly, for Kenny Creek, we do not also see any significant trend in pH value over the years, rather a random distribution of data from 5.0 to 7.5 here. And the same with the short-term assessment of the diurnal pH, no significant in the daily flux of pH beyond 1.0 standard units. So, like I mentioned earlier on, we assess the land use, land covered, and forest seems to be the dominant watershed use, land use within the watershed as compared to urbanization that's below 6%. And this is an indication that there's no any anthropogenic factor that might be contributing to this lower range of pH that we have been seeing in this assessment unit. Lastly, for our bio-assessment, we checked all sites against our fish biocriteria score and HBR macro index. For the fish biocriteria score, what we looked for, we tried to look for higher diversity of fish community within the assessment unit. And also we try to compare each of these assessment units with typical stream in the ecoregion or reference stream with the ecoregion. So typically we aim for higher score, which means the higher the score, the more comparable these streams are with typical streams within the ecoregion or even with reference stream in the ecoregion. So we can see for all our sites, Iron Fall Creek, Barren Creek, and Short Creek, we have generally similar stream compared to typical or reference stream within the ecoregion. And much more for Cannon Creek, Cannon Creek is mostly similar, particularly to reference stream in the ecoregion. With the HBI score, typically the HBI is an indication of, it measures the abundance of species of macro within the ecosystem, and it helps as an indication of water quality of the stream too. So the higher the score, the more susceptible these streams to pollution. The reason being, with the score, 10 represent, when we have, the score ranges between 0 to 10, and 10 represent higher community of tolerant species of macro within the system. So the more the tolerant species, the more susceptible this stream is to pollution. And we can see from all our assessment unit that we're proposing today, they all have great score from very good to excellent, as seen on the slide. And having come up with these, we feel pretty confident that the criteria that we're proposing are eligible for this assessment. I would like to welcome any question from the audience.
I'm just curious, how you actually selected the 5.5?
That's a very good question. We selected 5.5, even though the value for some of the stream could be lower, but however, we tried to do some research and we see that any value below 5 could cause any sublayer referring fish, but any value above 5 is still optimum for aquatic life use. That's why we didn't go beyond 5.5. I hope that.
Trying to think of how I want to put this, sorry. You indicated that you think it's a geological source for the kind of variability within the pH, particularly shale formation. I think you said sulfates.
Yes, the
So
pyrites.
was there any sampling for sulfates in these streams and compared to kind of some other?
We do not do any sampling, but we do know that. Okay.
We may have some sulfate data there that we could take a look at. That should have been part of our mineral suite when we went out there. Good listen.
The other question I have is, you characterize these streams as having no anthropogenic influence, but then if you go forward a slide or two,
To the land use?
yeah, the land use. I mean, you've got land uses up there of upwards of almost 6%. I would say that's a relatively high urban area for a particular catchment. In the Beaver Lake watershed, we have urban areas that are of similar percentages, and we definitely see the impacts of anthropogenic, sources.
We would note that, and we'll give you the consideration, sir.
Yeah, Darcy Ruth with the health department. As a geologist, every time you throw a little thing my way, I feel like I have to express an opinion. So forgive me for that, but I do think the shale with the pyrite is an issue, but I think also it's a disturbance, the shale issue. And when I look at your little map too, I've got that physiographic regions, which is a lot like the eco regions on my brain. And there probably aren't permitted mines right now out there, but there are little mines and quarries all over this area. And people even have mineral stakes to go out and find some of our rare minerals in this area. And there's a lot of quartz mining in some of these areas. So I don't know, you might, it's always dangerous to go talk to the geologists on the second floor, but you know, somebody's got to do it. And I also would be happy to do a little looking and digging around for you. I don't, you know, I'm not commenting on the, it probably does preserve the use, but I think it's premature to say that there's no anthropogenic influence there.
Thank you for that comment.
Testing. All right. I'm just curious. I mean, it looks like you had some dedicated sampling for over about a 3-year period. And you showed, you know, not a lot of variability within that period or even, you know, within a given day. Do you have any historical data that you look back further in time? Because I would think if something like land use was the issue, that doesn't change overnight. That changes over a long period of time. So are there any data points you could compare from 10, 20, whatever, however long you have data within these areas to see if those pH levels are still within this same range of variability? It seems like 3 years is an awfully short period of time to try to assess long-term trends from something like land use.
Sure, I mean, you're right that in some of these streams, we do have long-term data. Did we have a stream or two that we had some data from the 90s, or am I misremembering that?
That's for the geo data.
So one thing I would say to that is, you know, typically if you do a use sustainability analysis, that's a 1 to 2 year study, and that's for changing the use. We were there, 2 to 3 years, and we felt like we had a pretty robust data set as far as water quality, biology. So we don't think that this is that much different than if we were to go out and do a use sustainability analysis to change a use on a water body. Here, we're not suggesting changing uses, just shifting the criteria at the standard units. And so, the other thing with these streams is many of these streams are pretty small streams, and, as far as our ambient program goes, we typically hit some of the bigger water bodies, and so on some of these small water bodies, it's hard to get some of that historical data. So sure, we would love to have a 20 or 30 year data set on this, but in this instance, we just didn't have those on these water bodies. But due to the thorough sampling that was occurred at the time, we felt pretty confident in what we're proposing.
And in addition to that, I mentioned earlier that our assessment showed that these all stream supports are aquatic like this, and biology is an over time thing. It's not a current thing.
Right. I guess I'll concur on that. Biology is representative of the water quality over long-term trends. So if you were experiencing a degradation of that particular pH over 20, 30, 40 years due to land use, you might expect to see the associated biological components degrade as well. I'm just curious, if there was any older data points to look at. I just figured there were a few scattered out there over time.
Thank you.
I'm Sean Simpson. I'm just curious. I've looked at data in southern Arkansas, a bunch of your ambient monitoring data. There's a lot of streams that have lower than 6 pH. And I'm just curious if you're going to look at any other groups of water bodies or any other parts of the state and try to determine whether pH should be reduced or not reduced.
Thank you for that question. For this one that we're proposing, I mentioned earlier that we ensure to check for no MPDS facility upstream of the stream. So for some of those other sites that we're experiencing load, there might be MPDS facility, and that's why we're not looking at that. And also, based on the land use, there might be higher percentage of urbanization, and that's why we're not considering those. Joe, you might want to add to this.
Just to add to what you said, as we go out and collect data and get good data sets on water chemistry and biology, we will evaluate, what those standards are. As we collect data around the state, especially when we have biological data matched with, water chemistry over time, I think it's good to, look and see if we can refine those standards a little bit. So we're always looking to see if we can, refine things, especially on, site specific versus the eco-region number, to see if we can kind of dial that in a little better.
Thank you, Joe.
Hey, Justin Stroman, Arkansas Game and Fish. Got a couple of questions. First, has anybody talked to any of the Forest Service biologists about these proposed changes? A lot of these streams are on forest land and mostly forested, so they may have some opinions. I don't see anybody from the Forest Service here today unless they're online. But yeah, has anybody talked to them?
I did, early on, I just talked to Larry Steele with, he was with the Forest Service over in that area, and another gentleman, James, I don't remember his last name right now. So we did reach out to them early in the process and talk to them a little bit, but we haven't talked to them, I would say, the last several months.
Okay, well, I've got some contacts I can hook y'all up with over there that I think would be good aquatic people to talk to. And then secondly, you mentioned well, once you start getting around that 5 pH, you don't really support aquatic life anymore. We're proposing it to move it down to 5.5. Doesn't seem like that leaves much wiggle room for any sort of disturbance events that might spike the pH down some. So how are we going to handle that if we start seeing actually aquatic life change because of changing the standard? Like, how do we respond to that? Like, is there a we have to wait 3 years to do this whole thing again, or how do we handle that?
Let's just get a clarification on one point. So are you saying if it was to shut down to 5.5, and then we start seeing excursions below that?
Yeah, because you had some data that looked like it was closer to like a couple of points that may have been just outlying points, but they were pretty close to 5.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, so if we're now changing the standard, maybe a permit gets now introduced in this area, and they're gonna start lowering that pH a little bit. I mean, I guess the point I'm making is it feels like there's not a whole lot of wiggle room if there's like a 4.5 in there and stuff like that, which that's gonna happen anyway. But for standards lower, but we still feels like we have less buffer to kind of handle those sort of situations.
I mean, I would answer that by saying, if we assess those waterways and we do see that they do become impaired, then at that point it's an impaired stream, and we would, move forward with what we could do for restoration and things of that nature.
What's driving this need to move it down?
We feel it's a better refined pH standard for these streams. We had the water chemistry data, we had biology data. We looked at the land use in the stream and felt like it was a, relatively.
So this is something y'all propose yourselves, or hasn't been asked for.
That's correct.
Okay, all right, thanks.
And once again, as I said, Mr. Simpson, as we go through and conduct these biological studies, on any stream, whether it be, and whatever the parameter may be, we can feel like we can dial in the standard a little better, refine that a little bit. That's what we're looking
Thank you, Joe.
I got this turned on.
There's a button in the middle of the wires.
Hopefully you can hear me.
Thank you, please.
Hear me now? Sorry about that. All right, that's better. My question is, I guess related to this conversation, is the fish criteria scores what is supporting the rationale, part of the rationale change to lower pH range, 5.5, from 6 to 5.5?
Yes, sir. So with those biocategory score, it's just an indication that these streams are of good or excellent water quality. And so once we see aquatic life use being supported, that's an indication of good water quality.
Is that the strongest indicator of supporting that rationale of making that change? Is that fish criteria score?
Yes, sir.
James McCarty here. Could you explain the legal requirements for making water quality criteria less stringent?
So typically with, and this is for use changes, you conduct a UAA. So that would be, a typical, like, as I said earlier, 1 to 2 year study, you collect water chemistry, biology, et cetera, and do that. So that's specifically for a use change. But here we're not, proposing a use change, it's specifically a movement the criteria. So I'm not 100% sure if there is a legal requirement for adjusting criteria. There are for uses, but because of that, we kind of took the same approach that you would take if you were going to make a use change. For example, if we here collect life uses and we wanted to bring it down, 1 level, we would do a UA. So, okay. So 2.308, there's some language in the rule relative to site specific criteria. Would you like me to go through that? Did I answer your question?
Thank you, Jim.
Tate Wentz. Tate Wentz, so did all the 2.308 and the 304A guidance be met for this proposed change?
I was just gonna comment that my understanding is that whenever you have a change to the water quality standards, you do have to have scientific justification at a minimum, so, for any change to the matter.
Thank you. So, explains.
Just a quick question. So were these strains on the verge of being on the entire water body list? Is that, or were they coming close to that?
If they're all on it.
They're already on there.
And dissolved oxygen. The question was whether the strains were impaired or close to being impaired, and my understanding on the 2018 and the draft 2020 list, these strains are all impaired for pH and continuous dissolved oxygen.
And I would say that was one of the things that informed us to look a bit further to see what was going on there. Because right now with this scientific backing, we believe it's more of natural reflection of what is going on and not just impairing.
Yeah, Justin Drummond, Danny Fish. I'd be curious if y'all could just like assess, like propose like what you did in 2020 and what you're proposing here to see if any of those would no longer be impaired for pH. So I'd be curious to have that data.
Yeah, we can certainly do that.
All right, thank you. Going to be handing over to Ms. Mary Kennedy again for a discussion on the topics.
Okay, so everybody, we're about an hour. We have about an hour before lunch. Anybody need a quick break? Can take 5 minutes. Okay.
That's one thing I've always
We're gonna go mute on Zoom until we start back up.
Hey, Russell. Okay, Russell, yes, that's correct. The PH proposals are based on natural and non-anthropogenic. Okay, just a real quick note for those of you on Zoom. If you're a seated representative attending via Zoom, please use the raise your hand function, and we will unmute you and allow you to speak so those in the room can hear you as well.
Do you read it?
Okay, we had a comment, a couple comments earlier from Russell Nelson with EPA Region 6. He wanted to confirm the proposed pH criteria changes were based on natural conditions and not affected by anthropogenic effects. And so while y'all were mingling, I hopped on and verified that for him. And then sorry, he had another comment. We're trying to get pulled up.
Mary, since you were on that topic, can you tell us who else is on Zoom?
Okay, so for the seated representatives on Zoom, we have Sarah Ross, Christina Baker, Russell Nelson, and of course our Deputy Associate Director, Ellen Carter. You used to be. Okay, we have a few others. I just broke Kobe's computer. Okay, well, I will.
Give me just a second.
Yeah. We can read Russell's comment on such of the criteria shortly.
Here we go.
All right, let's go ahead and talk about our proposal for trout lakes. Trout criteria, or the trout waters, was added into the rule for streams in 1969 and for lakes 1988. We are proposing to remove the trout use for 3 lakes: Bull Shoals, Gers Ferry, and Lake Washita. The last time lake trout were stocked in Lake Washita was, actually, lake trout were never stocked in Lake Washita. And the last time rainbow trout were stocked in Lake Washita was in 2003. So for Bull Shoals, lake trout were last stocked in 1986, and rainbow trout were last stocked in 2013. For Gers Ferry Lake, lake trout were last stocked in 1998, and rainbow trout were last stocked in 1986. So we've had communication with Game and Fish that these lakes are no longer stocked or managed for trout. Therefore, we propose removing the trout waters designation from these lakes and moving it back to the same criteria as the other lakes in our state. So that would take the temperature from 20 degrees to 30 degrees, the dissolved oxygen from 6 milligrams per liter to 5 milligrams per liter. And as a note, we are keeping the designation on the Washita River below Blakely Dam to Highway 270 bridge, which that includes upper Lake Hamilton. So that trout use is staying. Do we have any questions on this proposal? Any comments? Okay. We'll move along. Okay, our next proposal is regarding the unnamed tributary to Lake June. The unnamed tributary to Lake June received the effluent from the Energy Harvey Couch plant. This was a steam electric plant, and part of the effluent was the cooling water. And due to this, They requested that in 2000, brain can't remember right now, 2005, okay. 2005, they requested a site-specific temperature criteria to help them account for the increased temperature in the effluent due to the cooling tower water. And in 2017, the Harvey Couch plant ceased operation. Therefore, this higher temperature criteria is no longer needed. So we're proposing to remove the current criteria of 35 degrees, revert back to the 30 degrees, which is the criteria for the Gulf Coastal Plains. Do we have any questions or comments on this proposal? And I think in y'all's handout, I had a typo. I had put 20 degrees. So we noticed that when we were reviewing our slides. But yeah, the Gulf Coastal Plains ecoregion criteria for temperature is 30 degrees. Right, if there are no questions or comments, we'll move along. So part of our requirements in the triennial review is to review any current UAAs. And specifically, we took a look at some of our waters that had had the fishable, swimmable use removed. So for this triennial, we are going to, for this meeting, I want to discuss 2 waters that had previously had the fishable, swimmable uses removed. Fishable is the aquatic life, swimmable is primary and secondary contact. So these 2 waters are both located in the Gulf Coastal Plains. One of them is the unnamed tributary to Smackover Creek, and the second is an unnamed tributary to Flat Creek. So let me start by saying that both of these use removals were adopted in 1998 into Rule 2. So in 1996 is when the use attainability analysis were conducted. Those studies were briefer than our current studies. They took a look at watershed size and flow regime. The watershed size for both of these unnamed tributaries is less than 10 square miles. They're very small. And during those studies, there was no sampling for fish or macroinvertebrates. Currently, there is no NPDES facilities on this unnamed tributary. So our proposal is to remove the site-specific criteria that says a year-round of 2 milligrams per liter to go to the ecoregion criteria, 5 milligrams for primary season DO and 2 milligrams for critical season DO. And we would also remove the exclusion of no fishable, swimmable uses, and those uses would be placed back on this unnamed tributary. The same for the second unnamed tributary. Study was in 1986. There were no fish and macroinvertebrate samples taken during the study. It's also a very small watershed. There is one active permit that discharges to this unnamed trib. We did have our permit section run models to see if and how their permit requirements would change. They will have some changes to their permit requirements related to dissolved oxygen, but not in a significant manner where they would have to do any upgrades. So the plant can handle these criteria. Our proposal is to remove the year-round 2 milligram per liter DO and go back to the ecoregion criteria of 5 milligrams per liter for primary and 2 for critical season, and to remove the exclusion of no fishable, swimmable uses. Do we have any questions about these proposals? Keep asking.
Tim Muller, just a quick question. So the one permitted facility, were they involved in the decision process? So do they know anything about this yet?
We have not reached out to them yet. Since we're in like this second process, we wanted to gather input from this group before we reached out to them. Yes, we will definitely reach out. Okay, we are moving right along, y'all. We have anything on Zoom?
Nope.
Okay. All right, I'm going to pass it off now to our ecologist, Chance Garrett.
Good morning, can you hear me? Okay. I'm going to talk to y'all today on proposed additions to, or species additions to our currently designated ecologically sensitive water bodies. Ecologically sensitive water bodies is a beneficial use designated for segments of stream that are known to provide habitat for threatened, endangered, or endemic species of aquatic or semi-aquatic life forms. So for our review of these species, we considered listed threatened or endangered at the federal level or state ranks of S1 through 3, and then additionally endemic species regardless of their rank. And these are we are not extending the habitat that is designated ESW or making any changes to the currently designated ESWs. We are just adding species to the sections of stream that are already designated that are known to provide habitat for. These designations were initially adopted in the 80s, and there hasn't been a lot of change to the designated habitat. And these efforts are a review of the species listed to update it to our current scientific understanding of the distributions and taxonomy of these species. Again, we're not changing the designated habitat, just updating what is currently designated. Currently, we have about 40 rivers and streams and several caves and springs in the Ozarks. Now I'm just going to go through, there in the handout, there's a list of all the species that we're proposing to add and for which each segment, what species is associated with them. So for this purposes, I'm just going to go through our plates as they appear in the Reg 2 and tell you the number of fish and the number of mussels that we're proposing to add to each of those designated units. So beginning in the Ozarks, with Illinois River, we're proposing to add 5 fish and 11 mussel species. And then moving west, in the Little Strawberry River, we're proposing to add 1 fish species and 12 mussels. And in the Strawberry River, we're proposing to add 6 fish and 17 mussels. The Strawberry River is included in this plate as well, but for the Spring River, we're proposing to add 11 fish and 19 mussels. And for the 11 Point, we're proposing to add 4 fish and 13 mussels. Moving into the Bostons, we're proposing to add 2 fish and 7 mussels to the White River segment. And in the forks and tributaries of the Little Red, they appear on both of the plates. And to these sections, we're proposing to add 2 additional fish and 16 mussels. The Arkansas River Valley does not have any ecologically sensitive water bodies designated within it. So we won't address that section. The Ouachita River above Lake Ouachita, we're proposing to add 4 fish and 5 mussels. In the South Fork Ouachita River, we're proposing to add 3 fish and 4 mussels. And in the Caddo River above DeGray, we're proposing to add an additional fish and 9 mussel species. This is the same plate, but there are several ESWs on it. So as we split it up, but we're still looking at the same section of the state. In the Mountain Fork, we're proposing to add 1 fish and 5 mussels. In the Cossatot, we're proposing to add 2 fish and 10 mussels. And in Robinson Creek, we're proposing to add 7 mussels. Moving west in Washita Mountains, Mayberry Creek, we're proposing to add 4 mussels. And in all of the forks of the Saline River, 10 Mile Creek, we're proposing to add 11 mussels. And then North Fork and Allen Fork, we're proposing 1 additional fish. And for the Middle Fork, we're proposing 1 additional fish. In our coastal plains ecoregion, the Little River above Millwood Reservoir, we're proposing to add 3 fish and 9 mussels. And in Grassy Lake and Yellow Creek, which is a unique habitat, we're proposing to add 2 fish and 6 mussels. And then in the lower Little Missouri River, we're proposing to add 5 fish and 6 mussels. Moving west in the lower Saline, we're proposing to add 3 fish and 10 mussels. And then in the main stem Washita, near the mouth of the Caddo, there is a small section that is designated, and we're proposing to add 5 fish and 8 mussels to that section. In the Delta, the river at the mouth of the spring, we're proposing to add 2 fish and 8 mussels. And at Departee Creek, we're proposing to add 9 mussels to that. And then where right-hand chute confluences with St. Francis River, we're proposing to add 8 mussels to that segment. And the lower St. Francis and the lower 10 miles of straight slough, we're proposing to add 4 fishes and 10 mussels. With that, we will open the floor to discussion.
Yes, Jason Phillips, Fish and Wildlife Service. I had a chance to go through this list, all the species in red. Probably don't want to go through it all here exhaustively, but there's quite a few errors in there in terms of what species occur in those streams. There's quite a few things listed that aren't there, and there's some things that need to be added either because they've recently split out as new species or because they just aren't included there, or they're recently proposed about to be listed species. So I can provide all that information for you guys, but just want to let you know there was quite a few. I had no idea a spectacle case occurred in so many places in State of Arkansas. Really, it's pretty limited, and it's like in almost every watershed on here. So I don't know if that's just a text or a typo or what, but there's quite a few species that are probably now considered extinct or at least extirpated from these watersheds. And like I said, some additions that need to be put in here. That's all I really had to add. Justin, did you want?
Justin Sherman, Arkansas Game and Fish. First of all, I appreciate you guys finally taking the time to start updating our list, since we haven't done it since what, 1987, you said? 89, something like that. I think I was, 5, 6 years old at the time. So that's good to see that. But I have to ask, the question is, why aren't we proposing any new water bodies? You've got 30, 40 years of new sampling data since this was done. There's quite a few more streams with what are listed here that contain SGCN and TNE species. Particularly what's concerning to me is the rapid growth in Northwest Arkansas, especially associated with a bunch of these streams. So, maybe that stream layer needs to get updated. It feels like, y'all are doing the effort to get the good science in here, but we haven't expanded this list any. So it's almost meaningless is kind of what it feels like. Like, yeah, we're updating our list, but we're not actually reflecting where these things are distributed in the streams in Arkansas. So yeah, I want to know why we're not proposing any new streams.
Reg 2.311 outlines the process for adding additional ESW designations, and that could be initiated in-house or it could be initiated by a third party. And any segments in particular that you're interested in, would like to see designated, we would review, and we would like to accept any proposals for.
Yeah, I would love to work with y'all's agency to sit down and comprehensively do that. And that's kind of what I've been pushing for several cycles now. Because we really need to have that discussion to make the actual regulation reflect what's intended by the regs. So it's just, there's some big gaps here, but I understand that there is a process that either you have to petition or we have to petition to make that happen, and I'm more than happy to start that, and we should do that soon.
Yeah, I'll speak a bit to that. During our last training review stakeholder process, there were several entities. I think we're somewhere between like 5 and 7 entities that all expressed the same desire to move forward on some ESW additions. We're willing to work together on that process. And so I sent multiple emails to that group, providing a lot of background information and some work that we had started when we had the resources. And I was unable to see any movement from that group. So
Yeah, I can appreciate the resource.
if your agency has the resources, that would be happy to review the proposals.
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna be a big undertaking,
There's
but it,
several steps. Yeah.
right, so I just want to encourage us to keep moving forwards with that, and please let us know what we can do, what our sister agencies, what our contacts can do to get that ball rolling. So thanks. Oh, and has Heritage reviewed this? It seems like right up their alley, Natural Heritage Commission.
We actually received our listings from ANHC, so they were involved. Okay. And if we have a representative from ANHC online. No other questions?
So this is moving along pretty well. It's kind of hard to determine how much discussion will occur in these meetings. And so we wanted to allow plenty of time to get plenty of feedback, but we seem to be moving along at a pretty, fast clip. So are y'all okay with us just powering through and trying to get it all knocked out before we take a lunch break? Everyone can get home earlier. We can open it up for a little discussion at the end. I think we have maybe one more topic to talk about. Before we kind of covered all the topics we had planned to today. And so I think what we'll do is just go through this last topic, and then we can discuss it and then kind of open the floor up at that point, have that discussion, and then just wrap it up for the day. Does that sound good to everybody?
So we're gonna get a chance to bring up topics that weren't necessarily on y'all's agenda then at the end.
We can open it up for some general discussion. Dr. McCarty looks like he has something to say.
Yeah, you just, the conversation might go on quite a bit.
Yes.
James McCarty, if you are to open it up, yeah, I think we could be here for a while longer, but I'm fine with powering through for right now.
Okay, all right, great. Thank you. All right, now we have Lindsay Boyle with the ecoregion boundary updates.
Right. I'm going to be talking about some of our proposed updates to our ecoregion boundary lines. We're proposing to incorporate more recent delineations with better spatial resolution. So the current Rule 2 ecoregion boundary lines were drawn in the 80s, and they're based on research by James Omernick. These lines were based off of what spatial data was available at the time, mainly large surface forms, natural vegetation, soil types, and land use. But the quality of spatial data has increased dramatically in this time, as well as spatial analysis tools. And so the lines that were originally drawn can now have higher resolution, and ecoregion boundaries across the United States have been updated as technology has improved. So delineation analysis now includes many more categories and factors, including geology, physiography, hydrology, wildlife, and much more. And so these new ecoregion lines would have higher resolution and would better reflect the geographic boundaries of our distinct ecoregions. All right, so here's a map of what the new ecoregions will look like, and we'll return and look at this more in just a second. In the table, you can see a few name changes that would be occurring to match EPA's current names for our updated ecoregions. And I also wanted to point out in light blue, is the Mississippi Valley Lowest Plains, which is Crowley's Ridge. And it is included in this map, but for this review, there will be no change to the criteria involved. It'll be the same as the original Delta ecoregion for both parts of the Mississippi Plain. So this is what our current Rule 2 ecoregions look like. You can see that these lines are very smooth. And then we can add in over top what the new ecoregion boundaries would look like in black. And you can see here the small areas of each ecoregion that would switch to a new ecoregion with those new delineations. And so this was what the new ecoregions would eventually look like. And you can see that they just seem to follow our mountain ranges and our large river valleys a lot more closely. It's just a much more refined line based on better spatial data. And so in all, this would affect 27 ambient water quality monitoring stations, which would switch from one ecoregion to another, as well as 78 permitted facilities. And in your handout, there are tables that list the monitoring stations and how many facilities from each ecoregion would be switching. That would take any questions. Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Y'all are unusually quiet today. So just real quick, I want to give y'all our tentative plan for next meeting. Save the date for May the 19th. We have set aside in this room 9 to 3 again, but who knows? Going so quick, maybe we'll go quickly again. But May the 19th from 9 to 3. At that meeting, we intend to discuss with y'all some additional site-specific criteria proposals, some additional criteria proposals, and we want to give y'all some status updates for some of our various studies that have been ongoing that y'all been aware of for the last several years. And then, yeah, so we'll let Joe come up.
Okay, so that went quicker than anticipated. So now I think that's a pretty good time to open the floor. If anyone has any questions or comments they would like to talk about, keep in mind if it's something that we're going to cover in the next stakeholder meeting, I might just say, hey, we're going to give an update on that at the next stakeholder meeting. But we'll open the floor.
Yeah, Jason Carney, Water District. Mary, what did you mean by more site-specific criteria proposals?
We have.
You have to turn it on.
Good question. We have proposals for another grammar. We have 3 site-specific DO criteria that we want to propose and we're discussing.
Why weren't they proposed on this one?
We really anticipated more discussion. Because our last training was just a cleanup of everything, trying to get everything in order, and since we're actually removing stuff and adding stuff, changing lines, and we just really expected more discussion. So
I think you're about to get it.
Hi, can I ask what happened to Coffee Creek and Mossy Lake discussion? I mean, that's going to be a change.
Correct. So I did want to bring this up earlier when we talked about the fishable swimmable uses. So I don't know if you attended via Zoom, the meeting the other night for Coffee Creek. So what we were proposing on Coffee Creek is essentially to add ecoregion uses to Coffee Creek. It's greater than 10 square miles, so they would have the normal ecoregion uses for any stream of that size, primary contact recreation, aquatic life, the DO for that region, what's a typical, which I believe is 5 in the primary season, 3 in the critical season, and no longer exempt from color or chapter 5 standards.
Mossy Lake, which is in the middle of Upper Cotton Creek and Lower Cotton Creek. It's not gonna have to change.
That's correct. So we had a stakeholder meeting 2 nights ago, or Tuesday night in Crossett, Arkansas, for this specific water body. And I did not give that presentation, but Basil Hicks, who's an attorney here at E&E, he gave a presentation and determining that Mossy Lake fell under the waste exclusion provision in the regs. Now, I'm not an attorney, so I'm probably not the best person to address those questions. But that was a quick summary of what he said.
One more question on that. So there's data to support based on the Parsons and Aquatar studies to support that there's aquatic life at Coffee Creek above and below Mossy Lake. Is there any scientific data to show that there is no fish in data, no fish, no aquatic life, fish and macrovertebrates? I'm going to get this out. Is there any data that shows there is no aquatic life in Mossy Lake?
So there were collections done in both of those UAAs, and there were limited, well, some sampling events, they caught nothing. Some sampling events, maybe they caught 1 gar and a bowfin or something like that. It was pretty limited in what they caught, but it was, I would say, very few things in general. I believe 1 sampling event, they did catch a bluegill and maybe another type of sunfish, but for the most part, whenever sampling was done there, it was very limited to a gar, maybe a carp.
Do you know if the department has ever used the wastewater treatment exclusion as a basis for saying water body is not fishable or something?
Do not know the answer to that question.
And this is just a thought, but from a precedent standpoint, I think that's a very concerning position of the department. DEQ is taking. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. There was just the one Tuesday night. Yes. Right. Yes, ma'am.
I'm gonna change subjects real quick if we're done with Coffee Creek, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. Just curious, and this may be another discussion like you're having at the next meeting, but where are we at with the development of sedimentation and bedding standards? Because that's been something we've brought up in this triennial review cycle now for at least since 2012, going back and documenting that. They had some stakeholder work groups. Felt like there was a lot of movement towards that, and then we haven't heard anything for a couple of cycles now. So I was wondering if we're still moving forward with that, or what's happening with the sedimentation and bedding standards.
I can tell you right that currently we don't have any proposals for sedimentation criteria in this revision. But we can look into that moving forward. I know that that's come up before. I have done a little background into that to see, what other states have done.
Yeah, like they went so far as to look at like Oklahoma, and like they came up with some pretty good standards. They even had it at one point, this stakeholder work group did to get that added to the reg, and it just sort of, I don't know, administrations changed, people changed, it sort of fell off. So I'd like to see that back on the target, because it's been a lot of time and effort putting this stuff together, and hate to see it just fall by the wayside, including DEQ. So
I did look at Oklahoma. I don't believe they have sedimentation criteria in their rule, in their water quality standards. I believe they do use it for assessment though, when they're assessing aquatic life, if I'm not mistaken. But I do recall looking at their water quality standards, and I don't believe they have anything in there on that, but I can double check.
yeah, I mean, that's I wasn't part of that group, however, I know our agency worked heavily on that, and Oklahoma was one of the states they used as sort of their template for coming up with this. Where it falls in their regs, I don't exactly know, but yeah, that's something I'd like to see us discuss, because we've been hunting that ball now for a decade plus, and it feels like going anywhere with it, and we probably should be.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you for that.
I was wondering if, this is James McCarty, Beaver Water District, if you could give an update on nutrient criteria standards development.
We'll be doing that at the next stakeholder.
Next stakeholder meeting, okay. I think I just want to revisit one more time, just the site-specific pH, our third agenda item there, and just kind of reiterate, like, I don't know that what's proposed could be perfectly reasonable. I'm not super concerned about the Ouachita region personally. I'm concerned about the level of investigation and research that was done and these being applied in other situations. And I said earlier, but I'm going to reiterate, referring to these streams as having no anthropogenic, impact, I think is not true. Just because they don't have an NPDES discharge does not mean that they don't have anthropogenic impacts. We have very low urban land use in the Beaver Lake watershed, but still we see evidence all the time of anthropogenic impacts. But a stream that has 2 to 6% urban is far from a reference stream, which is probably something that should be used when identifying whether this pH is appropriate. The other thing too is, and I think Tate mentioned that these are listed water bodies for those pH ones. So, but we're only given a very small subset of data for pH. If it's listed for pH, then data is that indicates that the pH was out of whack. So, what does that data look like?
I think I have to go back and look at the data set, but I would assume that much of the data that was on the graphs today was the data that got those streams listed.
That's correct.
Okay, that makes sense. But there's no additional data for those streams going back any further than what was presented.
Not to my knowledge, because like I said, many of these streams are streams that probably don't get, they don't have ambient monitoring stations on them. So, finding historical data or long-term data sets on some of these streams is difficult to do.
One final comment just on that topic. I think when you're looking at how aquatic life responds, especially to a disturbance in a stream, I think the lag time between when that disturbance is and when the actual change in aquatic life can depend on the disturbance and the degree of that disturbance too. I think 2 to 3 years of sampling on something like this is probably not adequate to kind of capture those changes to aquatic life. So there could be a disturbance that's occurred, and we're still seeing quality aquatic life indicators that maybe they haven't really caught up with that yet.
Thank you for that.
We're gonna make it a legal move here. I'm sorry.
This is actually was pre-approved as an alternate. I'm Colleen Gaston on behalf of the Water District. But I don't want to, if anyone else has anything else to say. Okay, so I just have some process questions.
Okay.
One, it would be helpful for us in, maybe while we have some time at this meeting, to first know a little bit more about the nutrient criteria. You say it's a new parameter, so can you give us a little more information on that?
I'm sorry, you said nutrient criteria is a new parameter.
For the next meeting.
Yeah.
It was just an update on studies working towards developing or collecting data towards those the development of that criteria.
Okay, so that's the update next meeting.
Correct.
Mary said there were some site-specific criteria, and she said 3DO, but then she also said a new parameter.
We're proposing some new additional criteria for Rule 2 at the next meeting, correct?
Which are, what are they?
We have some new toxics that we are proposing. Off the top of my head, I can't recall, but I know that there are a number of toxics we're proposing at the next meeting.
Okay, and I asked just because I don't have to talk about something necessarily that you are going to talk about, but that's still a little vague. The toxics is microcystin one of them?
No, it is not.
Okay, that's something that has been requested multiple times that be investigated. And certainly for drinking water utilities, that's an important parameter. So I'm going to reiterate that one. Now go back to some process issues. James talked about the process for basically downgrading the pH criteria. I'm curious, I don't know if Russell Nelson is still on the phone. You know, be maybe helpful to hear from him. You all talked about some of the legal requirements for essentially downgrading a criteria, also for removing a use. The standards in Rule 2 have some holes in them, I would say. So I'm just, again, more for setting a precedent, want to make sure that if the state is going to be downgrading some criteria or removing a use, which you're doing for the trout fisheries. And I realize that's a subcategory of a use and it's not directly addressed in Rule 2, but it's still removing a use. So does that require something akin to a UAA? Does it require economic and societal impact analysis? I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. I have a feeling Russell may have an opinion on it.
So what was the use again you were talking about removing? I'm sorry.
The trout fisheries.
That's an interesting question. And,
Yeah.
I thought about that myself. It's a difficult one because it's not like, something, the water body was degraded and the trout can no longer live there and therefore we're pulling that use off. This was kind of an artificial use almost. There was a put and take fishery and that is no longer a put and take fishery. So once that put and take fishery is no longer there, why are we applying criteria to that water body for a use that doesn't exist in the water body any longer? And so I agree with you. I think it's an interesting question in this situation because it's somewhat unusual. We can let Russell say something if he would like to. I will say that earlier in the UAA comment, when I believe James had asked a question on the legal requirements, Russell put in the chat to the group. Joe is correct on the UAA aspect. Chemical analysis is similar, but a UAA is defined in 40 CFR 131.3 and outlined in 131.10 would not be required if the use isn't being changed.
I think that comment, Russell's comment, I think was in relation to the pH criteria.
Right. It was the site specific when James asked the question regarding what are the legal requirements for that. So,
but for the trout.
Joe, can you hear me?
Oh, hang on a second, Russell. But yes, we can hear you. For the trout use, those lakes, we, as Joe mentioned, we did think about, would this need to follow the full UAA process? And we had discussed, if the stakeholder work group did not have objections, that we would develop a document in support. So, the documentation that Rule 2 requires, that we would have a document outlining that for the trout lakes.
And a further point on that is thinking about what would a UAA look like that to remove that use other than going out there and sampling and finding no trout. And then what is that, if you don't find any trout, what does that mean? That mean that the trout are no longer stocked there, or is there a water quality issue leading to no trout being there? Or could they not survive there anyway? And that's the reason why, because of natural conditions and water temperatures, because the water temperature for some of those is 20 degrees C. Now I know y'all have a big reservoir in the north, and I'm sure equilibric temperatures get above 20 degrees C pretty regularly during the summertime. So, and that's most likely not due to anything anthropogenic. I mean, water, epilognetic waters in Arkansas probably see greater than 20 degrees C most of the time, I would assume in the summertime. So I think that is a great point, and I think it's an interesting point. And I know Russell's on the line here, and maybe he would, could address that.
Joe, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
That's one thing that's unusual about the trout waters use. It's essentially a subcategory of use on top of an existing use. So the regulations really don't speak to something like that. It does speak to a requirement for a UAA if you're removing a subcategory or creating a subcategory of use that has less stringent criteria. So the reg really isn't clear on something like this. So I actually would kind of tend to agree with what you said, that because it is an artificial use, it's not a natural fishery use, that it probably wouldn't require an extensive UAA, but your supporting analysis of why you're removing it would probably be adequate for EPA's action or any determination we make.
Thank you, Russell.
Thanks, Russell. This is Colleen. But I do have a question in terms of, the type of, it sounds like, Mary, you do plan to do a scientific justification that's part of the packet that goes to the commission. Will that include some analysis of what the removal of the trout use and then the subsequent lessening of this criteria for DO and temperature, or making them less stringent, essentially, what impact that could have on downstream fisheries from those lakes? In other words, the water that's released from that reservoir that feeds those downstream trout fisheries that remain trout fisheries, is that going to change potentially, raising the standard or lessening the standards, have an impact on the downstream trout fisheries? I don't know.
Yeah, we'll definitely take a look at that.
And
This is Russell again. Colleen, I might can answer that. I mean, there's other parts of the regulation that require the state to provide that supporting documentation, but there's also specific regulations. I believe it's 131.21B, I think, that requires consideration of downstream uses. So that would likely be part of what we would expect in the state supporting documentation for that.
And I'll just say from our trout fisheries biologist perspective, I've had her review this proposal, and she does not have concerns with the tailwater being affected by this. I had the same question you did, like, hey, we're basically changing the standard to make it warmer, even though the fishery is not there. It's like, what's the other consequences that could happen as a result? So at least as far as the trout fishery is concerned, those tailwaters should not be affected by this standard, at least according to our trout biologists.
So next process question. What's the status of the anti-degradation implementation methodology?
so that's kind of driven through the permitting section, since they would be implementing that anti-degradation implementation policy. I know that it's been out for public comment. We've received comments on that. But after that, I'm pretty sure they have at least responded to those or working on those responses. But I can check into that and get you a more complete answer at the next stakeholder meeting.
I didn't think that was going to be your response, so I didn't mark it, but in DQ's filing to the commission in January in support of its amendments to Rule 2, there was a statement made that some change was not necessary or was made or not necessary, I don't even remember, because of the existing anti-degradation implementation methodology. I mean, it was stated as a fact that that was in effect, and it wasn't.
I'm not familiar with the statement, but my suspicion is they were talking about the anti-degradation policy that's in Rule 2, not the anti-degradation implementation, but I'm not sure.
Well, anyway, that came, it was in a part of the 2019 triennial review comments, documentation, supporting documentation. And it was, basically DQ saying we have in effect anti-degradation implementation methodology when that's not the case. And so, I think it needs to be clarified that that's still a very important missing component of the water quality standards. The aim is a part of the water quality standards, not permitting. It's used for permitting, but it is a component of water quality standards.
This is Russell. I mean, clearly the standards regulation requires both policy and implementation. While that implementation may actually come into play when a permit is established or renewed, there's still that regulation that requires that implementation be referenced in or be clearly tied to Reg 2 or now Rule 2. So I would anticipate EPA will speak to that action on the 2020 triennial.
Thanks, Russ.
Okay, last comment. And this is going back to something in the last triennial review that still puzzles me. And I've read the DQ responses to comments, and it just doesn't make common sense to me. So DQ has changed, deleted the definition for all flows, or no, deleted the word all from flows, kept the same definition as from all flows, but now calls it storm flows. Common sense, it doesn't make sense. And what's important, I think, and I never have gotten the answer to this, is back when those, say, turbidity criteria were established and they were called storm flows, my assumption and what I know of it is that those were actual storm flow numbers. And so switching the name just doesn't seem scientifically defensible.
Yeah, so I'd like to speak to that for a minute. So you're correct. The situation has been ongoing discussion with DQ and EPA and our stakeholders. And so when those criteria were developed, they were used, the sample, the data set that was used was, so there was just the base flow. We had just the base flow part of the year. And so the other set of criteria were the entire year's worth of data, including those data where storm flow were present. So because of that, the term storm flows got attached to those numbers, to those criteria, when DQ is a sport of using the term all, because it was just, we didn't just go out there and say, oh, it's storming right now, we're grabbing the sample now. Or we didn't look at any hydrograph separation and say, oh, this is a peak, so we'll use that kind of storm. We use the entire year's worth of data. So, and DQ's stance is that the term all is more reflective of how the criteria were actually developed. EPA probably wants to talk about that some too. But since the definition has not changed because how those criteria were developed has not changed. If we were to develop a storm only criteria and have a storm only definition, we would have to have a process by which to do that, by which to say, okay, these data points were reflective of when it was storming, and therefore we can set those criteria. And we don't actually capture flow when we're out sampling most of the time. We do sample flow with tidal biology, but our ambient program, and when our inspectors go out and when planning samples, or grabbing our in-situ samples, we don't collect flow. So we don't really have a process right now to say that, a sample was or was not a storm sample, therefore we can't develop an actual storm criteria. I don't know if I helped explain that.
That does, because that's the first time I've heard, maybe I just missed it, someone say the actual data that was used to establish those criteria that were called storm flows were not in fact samples exclusively taken during storm events. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, they're like the historical documentation that I've read says it's including when. So it's samples that included. So it was everything.
Yeah, you've looked at more than I had, but my just sort of recollection of a long time ago was that there was a real effort on EPA's part to collect those samples during storm events. It may not have been, they may not have recorded the precipitation or the river gauges or whatever, but, I just remember, people who were here a long time ago talking about those turbidity criteria, that there was a concerted effort to capture storm events. So maybe I'm wrong about that. You may, yeah.
My understanding was it was the 90th percentile of all data, so chances are it was going to be dominated by storm events, but it was all data.
Yeah, and we can definitely provide some of our historical documentation to the stakeholders.
So that makes me feel more comfortable that it's an appropriate number, but still and this may be an issue with EPA, but still calling it storm flows when it's all flows, that makes sense,
I mean, that's why we agreed, we tried to change it to all, and EPA disapproved that. So I don't know, Russell, if you want to give your 2 cents.
Well, I mean, that disapproval occurred in the 2007 phase 2 revisions. And some of the revisions made in this triennial address those issues. But one concern remains is that although the name of the definition changed, the content of that definition did not change. And EPA will likely speak to that in this upcoming triennial, or this 2020 triennial once it's submitted.
Yeah.
And that's actually all I could say on that.
Yeah, I think when Russell said this triennial, he's currently looking at 2020. Yeah, so, yeah.
All right, and just, I do think it's something that would be helpful for DQ and EPA to reach some clarification on, but also including the definition of critical flow and how that's handled and whether it should be in Rule 2 or not, or in what form it should be in Rule 2. So I do think, the flow issues are just critical to everything, all the other criteria, so, or most of them. So I do hope you will keep that on your important issues list. Thank you.
Thank you for the comments. Anyone else?
Hi.
Hello?
I just wanted some clarification on what we're going to talk about at the next meeting. It's going to be nutrients. We're going to talk about nutrients. We're going to talk about the anti-degradation implementation status, some of the other changes that are going to be made, and toxics. Is there anything else?
That is correct.
We were also going to provide a status on minerals.
Oh.
I said status, keep that on.
Well, I could hardly wait.
We were trying to build this, but you pulled it out of us.
Joe, this Russell, I kind of hate to go backwards, but I was unable to join right at 10 o'clock. So I missed the whole bacteria thing. So would you mind sending me your PowerPoint or something? So rather than have to repeat it here.
No problem, Russell. I can even give you a call and give you the talk.
Oh, boy.
And, we can provide something we did for the CrossFit meetings. We put those PowerPoints
as a PDF on our website, and so we'll do that for this presentation as well.
Yes, sir.
I'm Michael Clayton. County Expand.
Very good.
Are you able to hear me here?
Well, for some reason, that doesn't seem to be working.
My name is Michael Clayton.
Yes.
And I'd like to, if we could expand a little bit about the next meeting, the stakeholder meeting, expanding on the discussion of nutrients. Are we at a point that we can have some information on what that discussion might look like?
It's really just an update on the studies we're conducting. You know, it's not a super in-depth as far as, you know, development of actual numbers. We just wanted to get a status update on where those studies are that we're doing currently, collecting data that would, I mean, the data collection that we're doing will revise many criteria, but development of nutrient criteria is just one of those. So we're just giving a status update on the studies. We're not proposing any kind of criteria for this revision. Anyone else? All right, well.
I really have to think there's a lot to discuss.
Save it for next.
Yeah. So should we plan for a longer meeting next time? Oh, Miss.
Another process. I know that in some previous stakeholder participation policies with other triennial reviews, that you've concluded the meetings where you had your presentations, but then you gave the stakeholders a reasonable amount of time to write up comments and submit them to you, you know, again, before you actually came up with your final draft to submit to the commission. Do you plan to do that again? So I would say that I haven't actually discussed that specifically with Joe, but we do want to make sure that our stakeholder opinions are heard and fully vetted. So yeah, I think that would be something we could definitely do after our second meeting, is provide some time to receive any written comments. I think that would be much appreciated, and I'm just guessing that some of the comments though are going to be still, we want something on X, Y, and Z, and we may even say, we want this exact language to make it easier for you. I sort of get the feeling that it's a foregone conclusion that you're not going to expand the changes that you're proposing, but if that's the case, it's just this ongoing frustration for stakeholders that, again, that year after year, we say, please develop these criteria, please make these changes, and we're promised next meeting, next 3 years. So I would just like to encourage some willingness to consider maybe expanding beyond what you are thinking about proposing right now.
We do take that into consideration. If you recall, about a year ago, when we started, kind of opened up the training review process, we had a 45-day or 60-day period on if you have any kind of wishes that you would like for the 2023 revision. We surprisingly got very few comments on that. I think only 2 people submitted comments, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct, Mary? And so, but we're always willing to take feedback. Just one point about criteria development. Criteria development is very difficult. It takes a lot of data collection, you know, very robust data sets across the whole state. With the, you know, the number of staff we have, we stay extremely busy collecting data. We had an extremely busy summer last summer. We're going to have an extremely busy one this summer as well. So, you know, we're really working staff hard to get out there, get the data collected in order to bring that back and try to get some good analysis so we can, you know, develop defensible and really strong criteria. So we are working towards that. I understand that these are slow processes, but we certainly are, you know, moving in that direction.
In terms of data collection, are you using other partner agencies' data as well?
When we have data, we will pull that. It depends on what we're looking at, but we also, you know, one thing we want to use is high quality data. We want to make sure it's, you know, quality data, quality assured collected data with similar methodologies. And so, there's some nuance there as far as, what data you want to use, collect it in a similar manner, those type of things. But we do look for any kind of data that we can when developing these criteria.
Has DEQ ever considered communicating their kind of data collection strategy in terms of criteria development to other partners? I mean, like your water district, we collect tons of data. And if we knew what your strategy was, if we knew what like you were looking for, we honestly probably would alter our data collection strategy in order to help you guys out, because we're interested in nutrient criteria development. We want to see that happen.
Okay, I appreciate the comment. That's good to know. One thing that we are going to do, or I was going to visit the next meeting, but that we are developing a procedures manual that we want to put out there. So everyone, if you want to collect data the same way the DEQ does, we'll have that manual out there for you. It'll be everything that we collect on weightable streams and how we do that. That way we have comparable data, just so that's out there for people to use if they so choose. So that's one thing that we can do, but yeah, I think that's good to know, and we may be interested in the future.
Before we get too far away from the concept of the triennial in general, I just wanted to make this point really clear to both DEQ and the public, is to be considered a triennial revision, the entire rule has to be open for comment. You can't limit it to just what DEQ's proposals are. Now, that does not obligate DEQ to address everything that the public may ask for. That's the state's purview, because the standards process is a state primacy process.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, I just want to say, I would definitely appreciate some sort of response to the stakeholder level stuff before it gets out to the public comment, because, we're not just members of the general public. We all have a background specific to in water and would like to see our comments specifically addressed. I'm sure you guys can do that, but we would appreciate that. Getting some sort of feedback to our written comments before a draft goes out for public comment. I know you guys are busy, and, I get it, man, I get it. But any sort of effort you can do, even if it's just, hey, thanks for submitting something, Justin, I'd like to see something. So
we appreciate all comments from our stakeholders.
yeah, I love that comment.
But I mean, just realistically speaking, we plan on having our next one in May. Is that correct, Mary? After that meeting, we will be open for comments. But once June hits, I mean, we're in the field every week. Half of the staff at least is in the field every week for possibly 2 to 3 days a week. So it really does put us in a resource limitation on doing some of that stuff.
I'm sympathetic to that. I'm a field biologist as well, so I get it.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. We appreciate the discussion, all the feedback we'll get. Like Mary said, I believe we can put the PowerPoint on our Triennial Review website. So if you'd like to go back and review that. And once again, thank you so much. Look for an announcement. We'll send back out to the listserv for our next stakeholder meeting. We hope you can all attend again. And we just appreciate your participation. Thank you so much.
And I do want to say real quick, we have the little email up there, and we're using that one primarily because both me and Joe can access that inbox, so if one of us is out, like we're out on the field or he's away at meetings, we can both get to that. So if you have comments, discussion for the sale process, we really would appreciate that go into that Rule 2 email. So we're both kept in the loop simultaneously. I know you can CC us, but thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thanks for providing the remote link, Joe.
Yes, sir.
If we do go ahead, stakeholders, and send you some written feedback, say between now and the next meeting, will you post it on the page having to do with the triennial review so that everybody in the group can see, well, that anybody can see it, but.
We'll talk internally about that.
Okay. I mean, I think it might be helpful.
Thank you.
And since I have this one thing I forgot earlier, I I think you said something about the assessment methodology update when you were talking about, I guess, pH or some of the other proposed changes, but how is that going to fall in with the triennial review, and what do you anticipate in terms of the public process on the assessment methodology?
So, any criteria revisions would not get updated in assessment methodology until after EPA approval. So it really just depends on where the approval falls in the assessment cycle.
And we don't have anything scheduled right now for our public, kind of a public meeting for assessment methodology. But as we work through, and if we have the opportunity to do that, we'll send out an email to both our listservs, just so everyone's there or can.
I'm not thinking real clearly. When is the next 303D cycle? Sort of when is that?
It's 2020. The 2022 cycle's already started, just because we're running behind on that, and so we're working hard to get caught up. So we're going to be behind on 2022, but we hope to get caught up for 2024. So I would expect, and we haven't discussed this, there's no plan, but my suspicion would be that we will probably have a public participation process before the 2024 IR.
And 2020 is currently under EPA review, and 2022 is under like data review and preliminary assessment. So we're just in the NEC of the 22 cycle.
All right. Well, once again, thank you so much. We appreciate your participation, and we hope to see you at the next meeting. Everyone have a safe travel home. Thank you. Thanks everyone in Zoom for attending.
Yeah.